Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Louisville Seminary's, boy, my voice sounds so strong. Welcome to Louisville Seminary's Grawemeyer Lecture in Religion. Since 1990, Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary and the University of Louisville have recognized influencers from around the world who offer rich insights into the relationship between human beings and the divine, and the ways this relationship may empower human beings to attain wholeness, integrity, or meaning. I feel so significant right now with this resounding system. Charles Grawemeyer was a person of remarkable vision who deeply believed that, and I quote, "Great ideas should be understandable to someone with general knowledge and not the private treasure of academics." It is in this spirit that Charles Grawemeyer established the award in religion, as well as awards in music composition, ideas improving world order, education, and psychology. These awards serve as his mechanism for encouraging world-shaping achievement by encouraging great ideas. The ideas that our Grawemeyer Religion Award winners share challenge us to take a deeper look into what we as people of God believe to be true about ourselves and the world in which we live. It is through that challenge that we find affirmation, or at the very least, cause for further examination. And so it is with tremendous care and respect that Grawemeyer Award winners are considered and selected. Tonight, we will hear from someone who is certainly worthy to be included among those who have been recognized, a group that includes Eboo Patel, James Cone, Diana Eck, and other renowned thinkers. With that, I would like to thank and invite Tyler Mayfield, Louisville Seminary's A.B. Rhodes Associate Professor of Old Testament and Faculty Director of the Grawemeyer Award in Religion at this time, to introduce you to our 2022 Grawemeyer Award in Religion recipient.
Good evening, welcome. Thank you all for joining us for this special event tonight. We welcome those of you who are here with us in Caldwell Chapel on our seminary's campus, and also those of you who are joining us online. Tonight, we honor Dr. Duncan Williams, Professor of Religion and East Asian Languages and Cultures and Director of the Shinso Center for Japanese Religions and Culture at the University of Southern California. We honor him for ideas in his 2019 Harvard University Press book, American Sutra, a story of faith and freedom in the Second World War. During World War II, the American Army, acting under the authority of President Franklin D. Roosevelt's Executive Order 9066, removed persons of Japanese ancestry, who were mostly American citizens, removed them from their homes and incarcerated them in camps. Many Americans today know of these tragedies, if only in generalities. However, this terrible moment of discrimination in United States history contains a uniquely religious story. The majority of these dislocated and confined people were Buddhist. Their faith gave them purpose and meaning during a tremendous time of loss and uncertainty. And their lives broadened America's understanding of religious freedom and demonstrated that one could be both Buddhist and American. Professor Williams frames his book's big idea with this provocative question: does the fact of being non-white and non-Christian make one less American? He then proceeds in his work to describe how Japanese Americans during the war maintained their Buddhist practices and beliefs, as well as their faith in America. Williams documents the hard treatment of Japanese American Buddhists, comparing them to their German American and Italian American counterparts who were not treated similarly. In addition, he demonstrates that Japanese American Christians were treated better than their Buddhist counterparts. For example, immediately after Pearl Harbor, almost 75% of American Buddhist leadership and all Shinto priests were detained, while only 17% of Japanese Christian ministers were. He tells the story of Japanese American Buddhists who insisted on maintaining Buddhist practices and beliefs despite their captivity. Their faith inspired their resilience. And as a result of their story, a new form of less sectarian Buddhism emerged from the war, one that indeed did open the possibility of being fully Buddhist and fully American. Williams hopes that his book will open up a discourse about how faith in both Buddhism and America can contribute to a vision of our nation, quote, that values multiplicity over singularity, hybridity over purity, and inclusivity over exclusivity. Williams earned degrees from Reed College and Harvard University and previously held a distinguished chair at UC Berkeley. He has also been an ordained Buddhist priest in the Soto Zen tradition since 1993 and served as the Buddhist chaplain at Harvard University. This is truly a book worthy of the Grawemeyer Award, and we are delighted to have its author with us tonight. His lecture this evening is entitled American Sutra, Buddhism and the Second World War Japanese-American Incarceration. Dr. Williams, will you please come forward now for the presentation? Dr. Duncan Williams, on behalf of Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary and the University of Louisville, it is my honor to present to you the 2022 Grawemeyer Award in Religion.
Well, thank you so much, President Alton Pollard and Tyler Mayfield of Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary for hosting us this evening. Of course, the University of Louisville and the Grawemeyer Foundation for this amazing honor. It's just wonderful to be able to, after so long in this global pandemic, to be able to receive this honor and also lecture to all of you gathered here in the chapel today. I also understand those who are joining us by live stream. But it's so wonderful to be in person in this chapel together with my family. I mentioned my wife, Sun Young Lee, because that line you read, Tyler, she helped me with that line a lot. And I wouldn't be here without her help as an editor on the book. Since that publication, in 2019. This nation has gone through a lot, and for Asian Americans in this global pandemic, one of the things that we've seen is certainly the rise of a certain kind of anti-Asian animus and sometimes even violence. Just a few weeks ago, months ago now, I guess, but we passed the 1-year anniversary of the senseless, I think the security footage of this went viral around the nation of Wicha Ratanapakdi, just an elderly Thai American Buddhist man walking down the streets of San Francisco, senselessly attacked and unfortunately passing away. We saw those type of incidents one after the other during this pandemic. My own community in Little Tokyo in Los Angeles, a temple of ours targeted for arson and the lantern in front of the temple vandalized. That came on the heels of 6 different Vietnamese American Buddhist temples in Orange County, just south of us, being vandalized in the course of just 1 month. People spray painting the front of statuaries in front of the temple. Sometimes, in this case, you can see in this visual spray painting Jesus on the back of one of them. What does that tell us? That's where I want to start tonight's Grawemeyer lecture. This context that we live in, what are the roots of this kind of exclusion, of telling people that they don't belong in America? And to answer that question, we have to actually look backwards to history, I'm going to suggest initially to the World War II Japanese-American incarceration experience. So I want to take a moment throughout this lecture to introduce a few, I'm not going to do too much of it, but a few Japanese terms to orient ourselves, to frame some of our discussion today. And the first one is this idea of do or path, this idea that we all need, as religious people or even non-religious people, a way to orient ourselves in this world, a map to figure out who we are and where we belong. And so I'm going to start this lecture with a few maps. The first is of those World War II confinement sites. There are various ones run by the Department of Justice, the U.S. Army, a civilian agency called the War Relocation Authority, or the WWII. And they were, as you can see in this map, located all around the nation. It was a national project of incarceration. But I wanted to point out in this map something about what is at the heart of how anti-Asian animus, as well as other questions around race, religion, and American belonging come about. And that is of our map, of our thinking and understanding of the making, of the composition of this nation. When I, as an immigrant from Japan, first arrived when I was 17 years old in this country, I arrived in Portland, Oregon, and went to a small liberal arts college there, Reed College, and it was my introduction to a new nation, but also, this city called Portland, and I became a big fan of the NBA basketball team, the Portland Trail Blazers, and I would come to learn about pioneers who trailblazed their way west. Lewis and Clark was our rival college across the river, and I'd come to know something about one kind of view of America that was essentially built from England becoming New England, the westward expansion of the nation, where ultimately in places like Oregon, it would come up on the Pacific, and people would view the nation as having almost like in the notion of manifest destiny, a kind of God-ordained idea of bringing civilization from Europe to this new land, and bringing in civilization to a place that was deemed, although there were plenty of people here indigenously with civilization, a place supposedly devoid of that. And that mission would spread ever westward, looking across the Pacific, the trustees or the early regents of the University of California at Berkeley today were looking apparently across the Pacific as they were considering what to name their new university and what to name the town, the place where they were at. And they were looking across what would today be the Golden Gate Bridge towards the Pacific, towards Hawaii, towards Asia. And they recalled a poem called titled America by George Berkeley, the British, bishop and Anglican bishop, a philosopher and poet. And I'm not going to read the whole poem, but in this stanza, he talks about westward. The course of empire takes its way. The first 4 acts already past, the 5th shall close the drama with the day. Time's noblest offspring is the last. That idea of leaving behind an old and a decayed old world of Europe to create a new land of God. And so that kind of vision about a westward expansion of a peoples and a religion is what when I landed in Portland, Oregon, kind of understood as the basic storyline of the making of America. But, for Asian immigrants to this country, that doesn't make that much sense, because for most Asian people, you move across the Pacific eastward. The first groups arrived in the Hawaiian Islands and then to the west. That there's a different kind of journey. And what I found when I was doing the research for the book American Sutra was a different kind of poem, one written by a Buddhist priest that gave an alternate way of talking about America. This poem by Reverend Nyogen Senzaki is titled Leaving Santa Anita. Santa Anita is even today a horse racing track in a little bit east of Los Angeles City. And he was living in a horse stall in 1942, placed there along with most everybody else from Los Angeles County, where Japanese Americans were being placed temporarily in these horse stalls as the large camps in the American interior were being built for the wartime incarceration. And so in the spring of 1942, he's writing a note, a poem, to members of his multi-ethnic congregation in Los Angeles. He had some Latinx members and Caucasian, different kind of people in his group. And of course, if you were Japanese, you were going to be headed to these camps. And he's talking on the eve of going to a camp in Wyoming called Heart Mountain. And he writes this. This morning, the winding train like a big black snake takes us as far as Wyoming. The current of Buddhist thought always runs eastward. This policy may support the tendency of the teaching. Who knows? A little bit tongue-in-cheek, but he's talking about the U.S. Army's policy of rounding up anyone of Japanese ancestry and moving them to camps in the American interior. He has his camp in a place called Heart Mountain in Wyoming. But he also cites this line, the current of Buddhist thought always runs eastward. And it's a reference to a broader idea in Buddhist life that apparently in the early texts of the Buddhist tradition, it said that the Buddha, just before he passed away, said, I will no longer physically, be with you, but my teachings, the Dharma, would remain. And that he said the Dharma would move eastward and onto the 10 directions. And eastward and 10 directions just meant that from India, it would be spread, and then 10 directions means towards all parts of the world. And traditionally, for example, when Buddhism came to Japan in the early centuries, they viewed it as finally the founding of Buddhism in India through China and through the Korean Peninsula has finally come to our easternmost edge of, off the Asian continent, finally came to our islands. The eastward transmission, as prophesied by the Buddha, has finally come to us. But here, Reverend Senzaki is saying, I'm moving from California to Wyoming. I'm going to fulfill the prophecy of the Buddha too. It's a reframing of his own forced removal and incarceration in a Buddhist frame, and a reframing also of what is America. And I wanted to start with that map, that orientation about how there can be, from Central America, their American journeys are north, people from Quebec coming down, so the different directions in the making and composing of America. And today I want to focus on this one particular direction of Asian Americans and Buddhists claiming a place of belonging in America at a time when they were told you don't belong because of your race, because of your religion. This is just a sketch of Reverend Tsugi from during the war. This is him in his barrack teaching Buddhism to fellow incarcerees. He actually named his barrack a special name. He called it the training hall of the Eastward transmission. That's as far as he took that metaphor and made it his. But that's what I want to talk about today. What is the Eastward transmission? What is Buddhism coming to America, and what does that have to do with what it means to belong in America? I began this project, and this is the second Japanese word I'm going to introduce, goen. It means the mysterious karmic connections that connect us to a person, place, or situation. It's about interlinking the fact that our lives, our existences are interlinked. And I became interlinked with this project of American Sutra when my professor in graduate school passed away suddenly, just around the time of my defense of the doctoral dissertation. And just as a way to appreciate and honor his family, I was trying to help the family, clean up his office and set some, he had a massive collection of books on Buddhist studies. Family wanted to donate it. I was doing that kind of work, and I found in the cleaning of his office a sheet of several yellowed papers like this. And I started reading it, and it was in part a diary and in part a set of sermons. Location, a place called Manzanar, California, which I later would find out it was one of America's 10 concentration camps. And time during World War II. And his father was a Buddhist priest, one of the only few that was serving about 10,000 people in this particular camp. And I would come to, just as a way to appreciate my mentor and his family, translate this document. I never thought I'd write a book about it. But once I did that translation, other families began to approach me saying, we have our uncle or grandfather's Buddhist priest's diary. Can you translate that from Japanese into English? And that's how this project began. It wasn't something that I aimed to do, but I had a karmic connection to. And I felt like I was obliged to do something to tell this story. And one of the things in my research, as I tried to figure out what happened to people like my professor's father, why did he end up in a place behind barbed wire and armed guards? In the National Archives, I found documents about the very first person picked up by the FBI at 3 p.m. on December 7th, 1941. It was a Sunday. And being Sunday, many Buddhist temples were having their services that morning when the bombs fell. And before the smoke had even cleared, at 3 p.m., before the 3:30 declaration of martial law, the very first person picked up was Reverend Gikyo Kuchiba, head of the largest Buddhist temple in Honolulu, the Hompa Honganji Buddhist Temple. The second person picked up was a Buddhist priest in my own lineage of Soto Zen Buddhism, the Aieya Soto Zen Buddhist mission. And it just surprised me. I thought, at a time of war, if one's concerned about espionage or sabotage, maybe people at the consulate would be the first person you'd look to. Why Buddhist priests? Why were they thought to be a threat to national security? And I would come to learn in my research of people like Reverend Buntetsu Miyamoto that the FBI had prepared well before Pearl Harbor his warrant of arrest, that he was in fact on a list called Group A. You can see on this card, he's classified, it says Group A, individuals believed to be the most dangerous and in all probability should be interned in event of war, meaning prior to Pearl Harbor, in event of war, in anticipation of that, the intelligence agencies and the security agencies had already had a plan and categorized people as to relative danger to the national security of America. And on the Hawaiian Islands, as a category of person, Buddhist priests and Shinto priests, but not Christian clergy of Japanese ancestry, were considered as a category A, most dangerous. And that's why they were the first to be picked up. The temples had been under surveillance for years prior to Pearl Harbor. Registries and lists had been created in event of war, how to declare martial law, shut down radio stations. All of that had been planned well in advance. And so that made me think that we have to even look further back. We talk about anti-Asian violence and animus today and what happened during war. We have to look further back as to why it is that Buddhism, not just national ancestry, and so, was considered as a category to be not only un-American but anti-American. And to understand that, we have to go as far back as the first large group of Buddhists, because during World War II, the Japanese American community represented the largest group of Buddhists in North America. But in the earlier period, it was the Chinese American community. They started coming to America much earlier than the Japanese and working on the sugar plantations of Hawaii and, of course, in the mines, gold mines of California and the Transcontinental Railroad building. They had come to America seeking opportunity. But there were voices that said there are too many Chinese. The language that was used, the kind of pejorative slur word used at the time was the heathen Chinese, a racially unassimilable group, and religiously unacceptable or non-Christian group that was viewed as a kind of invading, you can see this pamphlet, The Chinese Invasion, language about a heathen Chinese despotism in San Francisco, and the need to build, this is, it's a popular magazine, it's an illustration from Harper's Weekly, a Chinese wall around the United States of America, symbolically on the Pacific Ocean, I suppose. But the idea of exclusion that would lead to the first federal immigration law. Before then, people they didn't need to get visas or do Homeland Security check. They just came to America. But now, a whole group was targeted as unwelcome because of their race and because of their religion. And we see this even after that law is passed in a different Harper's Weekly illustration, the Yellow Peril. You see one land that is illuminated by the Christian cross. It's kind of light and you see a threatening, ominous cloud in the distance with a Buddha in it. In an illustration called the Yellow Peril, this idea of kind of a racial group, but also a religiously different group, threatening the integrity of a land, and that same rhetoric translated in 1943 during World War II. In this other illustration, you can see a samurai figure standing behind a Buddha on top of a militarized tank. So that kind of idea that Buddhism represented not just an ideological, religious, theological different, movement and maybe a rival or a threat, or like as a world religion, but no, it was actually a threat militarily, national security-wise, to America. And so that was the context in which those first priests were arrested. But eventually, of course, it wasn't just the community leaders, the Buddhist priests that were taken by the FBI. Those categories of ABC didn't matter for the people on the West Coast of the United States. After President Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066, it gave the Army the full authority to determine anybody that they deemed a national security threat, regardless of intelligence agency assessments and so on. And with that, every single person of Japanese ancestry on the West Coast was rounded up. It didn't matter if you were a little baby, infirm grandmother. It didn't matter if you were a U.S. citizen or a Japanese national. And that group of roughly 120,000 people rounded up and put in camps in this mass incarceration of the spring of 1942 after the executive order. That group was in fact 2/3 U.S. citizens. So without the constitutional, usually before you end up behind barbed wire and you got armed guards and in some kind of prison, usually you have a trial. You're accused of committing some. But these babies and then grandma, it didn't matter. If you had a single drop, that was the wording used by Colonel Carl Bendison, the chief architect of the implementation of the U.S. Army policy 9066. We even went to an orphanage in Los Angeles. And when the orphanage director asked him, because there was a bunch of small babies and young kids of Japanese ancestry, including mixed race kids. At that time, California had an anti-miscegenation law that didn't permit for multiracial marriages and that kind of thing. So the kids were often given up for adoption. And when the orphanage director asked him, what about these mixed-race kids? Do they also need to go to camp? They're little babies and 5-year-olds. And he said, if they have a single drop of Japanese blood in them, I want them in camp. That's the direct quote. So that's how thorough, I call it the ethnic cleansing of the West Coast was. Every person of Japanese ancestry picked up. And they ended up in places like this. I mentioned the horse racing tracks of Santa Anita, horse racing tracks in San Francisco area, Tanforan Assembly Center. They were called assembly centers euphemistically, as they assembled to wait for the large camps to be built, temporary facilities where just a few weeks ago it could have been cattle or horses that were in that space. In Portland, this family went into camp, and one of the things that, in terms of religion, that they faced right away was that this family, as well as every family that went into these temporary detention facilities called assembly centers, they were, as you might imagine, going into prison, searched for contraband. You'd think they searched for like guns or because they're worried about espionage, maybe cameras. That's what I think families expected. But they were also told that any book, any printed material, like a Buddhist Sutra, that had Japanese text or kanji, like Japanese characters, that was contraband. Even like a book of poetry, like a haiku poetry, that's contraband. And the only exceptions to that was if you had a Japanese language, English, Japanese, like dictionary, that was okay. Or if you had a Japanese language Christian Bible, that was okay. So what's the message that people are receiving? I think they're being told, look, you don't belong, you're a threat, you don't belong. But if you want to belong, learn English. That's why if you needed Japanese, then that's permissible. And become Christian if you're not already. So that was the message the government was sending to them. But what I want you to notice on this slide, this is the family of Reverend Tansai Terakawa from the Oregon Buddhist Church in Portland. They try to make their living quarters as, decent as possible. But what you also see, this is a Reverend Tansai Terakawa's daughter, Hiroko, playing checkers with her friend, Lillian Hayashi. But you see on the wall a Buddha image and a large American flag. This was one family that didn't accept what the government was telling them. They were saying we can be both American and 100% American and Buddhist at the same time. So that's another aspect of this book, American Sutra. It's the embodiment of these people who were a majority Buddhist population to say, our founders didn't say you have to be Christian to be an American. They talked about something called religious freedom. And we're going to exert that and talk about our belonging here. Maybe symbolically like this, but we're going to maintain our faith. And so in this next section, I want to talk to you about how people did that, maintained their faith in all of, being sent to these places with a week or 10 days notice. Imagine if we have to look at in our own apartments or houses to figure out, how am I going to sell this? Our business is far, How am I going to find what I can take to camp is what you could carry. So for most families, a single suitcase, what would I put in that? And so people couldn't take much. It was to a place a little bit distant and unknown for a time indefinite. And that's when they had to become creative, adaptive. And in the Buddhist tradition, we have this is the third Japanese word I'm going to share with you today, hoben, in Sanskrit, upaya, which means skillful adaptation. It comes from the Buddha's own teaching that when he preached, he would adapt his teaching, the medicine of his teaching, to the illness or the kind of disease and the kind of the difficulty the person who was right in front of him was having. And that is the best dharma, or the best teaching, is to adapt it to that moment, as opposed to relying on abstractions. You make it real by really feeling the time and place and situation of those who might need teaching to help ease and alleviate suffering. And so when people went to these camps, they tried to make do with what they had available in their suitcase, in their environment. There's a Buddhist teaching in my lineage of Soto Zen Buddhism. Our founder in Japan is called Zen Master Dogen. He teaches that in a text called Instructions to the Cook, Tenzo Kyokun, he teaches that inside of a monastery, after the abbot, the second most important person is the monastic cook. And he talks about how the cook is responsible for maintaining not only the physical nourishment of all the people in the monastery, but the spiritual nourishment as well. And that the attitude they use towards their food and cooking is transmitted and becomes imbued into how people take in what they eat. And so it's very important for the monastic cook to be trained and instructed correctly. And the two things he mentions as most important is, number one, the cook should know what is in the kitchen pantry or the kitchen, ingredients. Should have a very close attention to inventory. If the cabbage is getting bad, you should know about it. And then he said, in the second instruction, don't cook for your own pride, your ego as I'm a great chef. Not like that. Do it because you're doing it to sustain the physical and mental well-being of everyone. And then he also taught, and this is the part that, we can see this as just instructions to a monastic position inside of a religious community, or we can see this as a metaphor. The kitchen is actually about ourselves. That we should know all the ingredients, who we are, who am I. We should see that clearly. And that we should know that maybe sometimes we don't have just great ingredients, but maybe some parts of our personality, there's some defective things in there too. But to be honest and accepting fully responsibility for all of it. And then to cook that for the sake of other people. It's like a mirror and wisdom to yourself and compassion or guidance to others, to help others pursue their path. And so this idea of cooking with what's available, this was very deeply imbued in how people maintained their Buddhist faith in camp, how they got through those difficult times of loss and disorientation, how they managed to find things like desert wood. They'd go to the mess hall and find wooden, at that time, packaging was like wooden crates for fruit and vegetables. They would take the pieces of wood and find a way to kind of build a beautiful Buddhist altar. They would take their rationed, in some of the camps under the Geneva Convention, they had a rule of one piece of fruit per week. And they would keep the peaches, or the peach pits to be more precise, enough to make a prayer bead, because that particular individual it's a Buddhist priest that was unable to have brought that in to camp. People made do with what was there, And what Dogen taught was that a mediocre cook, if you have great ingredients, you can still cook a decent meal. But a Buddhist cook is somebody who can take mediocre and even bad ingredients and transform them into something meaningful. And this is what Reverend Takahashi Seizu did in one of the camps. He was writing in his diary about how he was so annoyed that he couldn't practice his Buddhism, his meditation practice, because the searchlights from the guards was just going on all night, and there'd always be check-ins, and he couldn't settle until he had this insight. In his diary, he writes, "I returned to the quiet and supreme life of walking alongside Kobo Daishi," that's the founder of his tradition, "as if trying to practice meditation under the moonlit pine. I had been viewing the guard's searchlights as the Buddha's sacred light and had been practicing Komyo meditation together with Kobo Daishi." He took those searchlights, and in that style of Buddhist meditation, you usually visualize in your mind or consciousness the movement of the symbol of enlightenment, which is the moon, across your mind. Those searchlights suddenly became a meditation aid. That's cooking with what's available. This is second to last Japanese word I'm going to leave you with, nembutsu. Usually people translate it as recalling the Buddha's name or chanting the Buddha's name, right? But it comes from this idea that when the Buddha died, as I mentioned, his physical presence is gone, but the teachings remain, and that if you use your mind, you can imagine. The mind is capable of imagining that which is absent and making it present again. That's called nembutsu in the Buddhist tradition. And for those who are in camp, one of the other ways that religion and Buddhist faith mattered most was, of course, not only after losing everything, their businesses, their livelihood, everything that they worked so hard for as immigrants or American citizens back in the west coast of the United States, many people in those hastily built tar paper barracks of the camps, hastily built so that it was so cold during the night and so hot in these desert locations during the day. Bugs were crawling, it was not well built. And so the very vulnerable, the elderly, young babies, you see in this photograph a little baby's photo of a funeral in camp. Those first months and half year, so many people didn't make it. And if it were up to the government, they wouldn't have done anything. But for the community and the Buddhists, and as well as the Christians in camp, they wanted to say, every life here, those who passed away with your little baby or your grandmother who may have died anyway, but you died here in this camp, and we're not going to forget you. We're going to do something to not only honor them, but give solace to those left behind. And so they built things like this. In 1943, my professor's father, this is a picture of Reverend Shinjo Nagatomi, he helped to build and hit those characters, I, Re, To, the three characters on the monument. It's a 5-tier stupa base. It's a Buddhist-designed kind of memorial monument of traditional basis. But he went around, barrack to barrack, saying, all these people that passed away, we need to honor them. Can you donate 5 cents? Can you donate 10 cents, 15 cents to buy the concrete necessary? And it was an interfaith effort. A Catholic architect designed the monument. They launched it on a day where they had a Protestant pastor and Reverend Nagatomi together, said this is for the whole community. It's a shape like a Buddhist monument, but this is for everyone who's passed away. We want to honor them. And I-re to. To means tower, I means to console, and Re means the spirits. It's a tower to console the spirits of those who've come before us, who've passed away, but also those who are remaining here. And this was made in the cemetery by the YBA. It's like the Buddhist version of the YMCA and YB. It's called the Young Buddhist Association. They physically constructed it in the middle of the cemetery at the Manzanar concentration camp. And so that's how people brought back those who had gone, absent, back present. They recalled them and honored them. And this is ever more so as the war went on with those, and if you can imagine the irony of this, people, American citizens, young men, there were some young women as well in the WWII, but mainly young men who served in the U.S. military. At that time, the racial politics was such that they were a segregated unit, just like African American soldiers were often in segregated units in the European front, in a combat unit called the 100th Battalion, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, which even during the time of the war was in the press dubbed the Purple Heart Battalion. They were always put on the front lines, and in not just World War II history, but in the entire history of the U.S. Army, this segregated unit is the most decorated regimental combat team. And as the irony, of young men, sometimes volunteering, sometimes being drafted to serve their country, leaving behind their siblings and parents in these camps, came, back in ashes. You can see in this photo, their ashes, their photos are up on, this is from Minidoka, Idaho, concentration camp in Idaho. The camp administration finally realized you have to at least let the Buddhists and other, the majority of those who serve be able to have services to honor these people. And there were those who also served, Buddhists especially, in the Pacific, the military intelligence service, translating documents, doing prisoner interrogation, code breaking. General MacArthur's chief of staff said, without these Japanese American translators, vast majority who were, because they were bilingual and went to Japanese language school at the Buddhist temples, they were almost all, 90% of them were Buddhists. He said, without these individuals, the war would have extended 2 more years and American lives at least 1 million more American lives would have been lost in the Pacific without that small group of Japanese Americans that were doing the code breaking and translating work. And so these people kind of served their nation, and from the Buddhist point of view, one of the big questions of belonging was, can we belong and be recognized in the U.S. Army? An army that, despite their unit being majority Buddhist, they had hoped that if they were to sacrifice their last rites would be somehow, conducted by a Buddhist priest. But at that time, the army was unable to go as far as to acknowledge that that would be possible. So there were only Christian ministers in these units. But inside the camps and also on the islands of Hawaii under martial law, people began a campaign to recommend to the U.S. Army and the Secretary of the Army that eventually chaplains would be assigned, and that more importantly, that even if there were only Christian chaplains, surely they would need to know what the religious faith of the Buddhists were. And so could we not have a B on there? They called it the B for Buddhism campaign. And thousands of people from within these camps wrote to Washington, D.C. to get it. And eventually, it was only after the war, B was admitted as one official religion recognized by the U.S. Army. But until then, and during World War II, it was a case that you would either get a C for Catholic, P for Protestant, H for Hebrew, meaning Jewish, or just X for nothing. And so it was that some people, as you can see in this photo, just added an extra tag themselves, saying, I'm a Buddhist, while others try to make some kind of humor out of it. I talk about in American Sutra story of one young inductee in Hawaii who goes to an army recruiting station volunteering for this unit. And he's asked, okay, what race are you? And he said, I'm Japanese, and he said, no, our categories are like Caucasian or Mongolian, and so he said, you're a Mongolian. And then he said, what's your religion? And he said, I'm a Buddhist. And he said, son, we don't have Buddhists in the U.S. Army. and pick another one. And he said, okay, I'm going to pick P. And he said, okay, why P? And he says, because I protest. So that was his way of trying to find a place with a little bit of. I mean, he's assigned to latrine duty for 3 weeks apparently after that. But he tried to claim a place. So that's kind of also at the heart of this book. Are people that use Buddhism as a refuge, a protection. You see these thousand-stitch prayer beds, other things in combat, but serving their nation, but also making this claim that we belong and forcing the government to recognize that Buddhism is just another religion that the founders would have been open to the idea that you could be American and you could be Buddhist, and that was not an impossibility. But as people started to come back, sometimes, dead from the battlefront, and as the camps closed after the war, this is what they returned to. People telling them that we don't want Japs here. People not giving them jobs, ability to rent homes. And eventually, temples became another kind of refuge of a hostel. They call them Buddhist hostels. Wonderful Christians, like the Quakers, also opened up their spaces to allow both Christians and Buddhists to have places when they returned to the Pacific coast to settle for a while until they could get their feet back on the ground. But people faced lots of animus, lots of hostility based on their race, based on their religion. Temples were burned. Temples were vandalized, you see here in Seattle. So that destruction and harm is something I want to end with and come to a conclusion with the last term I want to talk to you about. The last Japanese word I'm going to introduce today is kin tsugi. The first character, kin, means gold. Tsugi comes from the verb tsugu, to join again. And it comes from a Japanese ceramic tradition that is Buddhist informed. A ceramic tradition that says if you have a teacup or a favorite plate and you drop it about, and it breaks, instead of throwing it away, you use lacquer to kind of rejoin the parts. And instead of hiding that fracture line, you adorn it with gold. All right. I want to talk about that in the context of what I'm calling the repairing the karma of the nation, because I think that's where American Sutra as a book is trying to suggest to us a Buddhist vantage point about how to deal with not only that one incident of the World War II Japanese-American incarceration, but how it's interlinked and interconnected to so many other communities' histories in America and our nation's histories. I call on this term karma of the nation from Reverend Kyoshiro Tokunaga. He was a Buddhist priest arrested, taken to LA County Jail, taken to Tuna Canyon Detention Center, and on the train to the Santa Fe internment camp in New Mexico, he falls quite ill. And an African-American train porter helps him to regain his strength. And not only his physical condition, but through talking about what respectively Japanese American and African American communities have faced in terms of challenges of being excluded, being told you don't belong, it's second class. He said that helped him so much that he, after the war, when the camps closed, he was in the camp in Crystal City, Texas, at that time a segregated, train. And he had to decide, do we go in the white section or the black? And he decided to go in the black section because of his feeling of solidarity with that porter that helped him so much. And after the war, he became very involved in the Japanese American reparations movement. He was the only Buddhist priest on a piece of lawsuit, reparations action that went forward in the 1980s. And he coined the term to talk also about African American reparations and about all kinds of difficulties this country faced, by talking about the idea that not just individuals have karma. It's not just that I do something good and have a positive karmic consequence, or something negative and have a negative consequence, but that whole nations can have that. And so I want to end with a little story about like a postscript of American Sutra. I found out that right after my publication, a founder of a movement called Tsuru for Solidarity, Tsuru means crane, one of the co-founders had taken color photocopies of the front cover of my book and made some paper, as you can see here, cranes out of them. And this movement was one where camp survivors from the World War II Japanese-American experience felt a kinship with what was going on in 2019 at the southern border. As you may recall, large caravans, as I recall, large groups of migrants seeking asylum in the U.S. from Central America were not permitted in, were, as a kind of policy deterrent, their children were separated, to kind of deter people from coming. And many of these camp survivors from World War II felt that because their own fathers had been taken away by the FBI, they felt something about family separation and being put into detention centers. And especially when the largest one of these facilities in Dilley, Texas, South Texas Family Residential Center was basically located right next to the Crystal City internment camp from World War II, they felt they had a moral obligation to speak up. And one of the founders used the cover of my book to make these cranes, and they had tens of thousands of cranes that they put on the fences of the Border Patrol and ICE detention facilities to say, back in World War II, maybe nobody spoke up for us, but today we feel our moral obligation. We feel our interlinked history with this current situation. And so people started making cranes, lots of them, going to different places. When Fort Sill internment camp of World War II was being considered for a removal of 1,400 children from Texas to Oklahoma, at that time I actually got involved as well and tried to organize some Buddhist priests to do ritual and ceremony, remembering the past, connecting it, interlinking it with our present, interlinking it with what's going on with deaths in that camp back in World War II, deaths in the ICE detention facilities in recent times and memory, working together with Latinx dreamers. It's kind of an odd combination of Japanese American people and sometimes elderly camp survivors working together, and Buddhist priests working together with young dreamers. But this is the kind of thing that leads us to believe that our freedoms, our futures are intertwined, our pasts are interlinked, and that when we note these interlinks, it's when we can find that we don't have to hide and shy away from those crack lines in our history, in our present, and that we have to adorn it with gold. We have to think about reparations. We have to think about how we pay attention to these lines and not be afraid of it. I often think of Frederick Douglass, who in his 1869 speech, talking about this rising anti-Asian, especially anti-Chinese, the Chinese Exclusion Act was well on its way in terms of that rhetoric of the heathen Chinese, a racially and religiously unacceptable group in America. He spoke up and talked about a different vision of America, one that was not about a singular identity, but composed of a composite of multiplicity of different people, of different parts of the world, different creeds and religions, making up the power of the United States of America. But he also reminded us that, in a different text, that, immigrants seeing economic opportunity, like it's on the backs of the wealth created by enslaved people like himself. And I think that interlinking of these histories is something that still resonates to us today. And so we come to this moment in 2022 where, it's been a few years since the book came out, but it does feel like it's meant to be an enduring book, but it's feeling very timely. Timely that we acknowledge the voices of those whose histories have been written out, have been excised from, when they were put in these camps, from the American landscape and excised from the American story, that we take some of those voices, the Buddhist voices included, to bring all of us from our own traditions ideas about how to repair the nation, how to heal the nation, how to, all of us together, find our interlinked connections with each other as we come to create a nation that's not about singularity, as Tyler mentioned at the beginning, but about multiplicity, not about exclusion, but about inclusion, not about all the ways in which one vision of America that says America is essentially a white Christian nation only. It is a white Christian nation too, but it's not only that. Are we gonna rise to the challenge in our time of making an America that is actually multi-ethnic in character and religiously free, and by implication, therefore, religiously plural? And what is it that we inherit as the kind of racial karma of our nation, all those fractures and break lines that make it so difficult for us to apparently talk beyond our religious traditions or our racial categories? How can we build something that would honor also somebody like Frederick Douglass, who saw this nation as being multiple, multi-ethnic, religiously free? And so with that, I'd like to conclude this year's lecture. Thank you.